It's been a month since a deadly hantavirus outbreak was first reported aboard the MV Hantavirus, and since then, the story has become many things. A story about our lingering COVID-19 trauma, a story about how shitty America's global outbreak response has become, and a story about how no one should ever go on a cruise, ever, even if it is a really awesome bird-watching one. But according to 3 infectious disease scientists I spoke to this week, hantavirus also needs to be a climate change story, specifically a story about what happens when a hotter, more chaotic planet reshuffles where diseases can spread. Here's what one scientist told me would happen if we decide to ignore or dismiss the climate angle of the hantavirus story.
I think we missed the opportunity to get ahead of the curve. Climate and climate health models allow you to see into the future. Knowing what's coming would actually save you a lot of money and potentially also a lot of lives as well.
So what is coming when it comes to hantaviruses and climate change? How are they connected? And how could the rapidly approaching Super El Nino, a phenomenon worsened by climate change, affect the spread of hantavirus and other infectious diseases? That's what we're going to get into today. Now, reporting on the climate change footprint of a specific disease outbreak is kind of like reporting on the climate footprint of a specific hurricane or wildfire as it's happening. If we don't have an attribution study yet, it's really difficult to pinpoint the exact influence. In the case of this specific outbreak of the Andes virus, that's the only strain of hantavirus known to spread from person to person, we still don't even know exactly where it originated. One rapidly spreading theory is that the first known patient was exposed while birdwatching near a landfill outside Ushuaia, Argentina, but local officials, birding guides, and medical experts have strongly pushed back against that theory, saying it likely originated further north. But even without that information, we can still talk about the conditions that make hantavirus outbreaks more likely. And generally speaking, a hotter planet and infectious diseases are a bad mix. At least for humans. For diseases, it's actually pretty great. A 2022 study in Nature Climate Change found that over half of known infectious diseases have already been made worse in some way by climate hazards. In many cases, that's because a changing climate allows disease-carrying wildlife to spread into places they didn't used to be. Here's Dr. James Shepard, an infectious disease specialist at Yale University.
As the planet warms, as the environment heats up, then the range of diseases also changes, because diseases that are tropical or subtropical diseases can now become temperate diseases if their vectors and their reservoir hosts can move northwards, for instance, which is what we're seeing with tick-transmitted infections. Then they can move into areas that had never seen them before.
The good news is that hantavirus is not a tropical or subtropical disease, so it is not at risk of moving into temperate zones. The bad news is it's already in temperate zones because it's a global disease. There are more than 40 types of hantavirus across the world, and they exist in rodents pretty much everywhere. So, in terms of climate change, infectious disease experts aren't so much worried about hantavirus reservoir hosts, that's the science term for disease-carrying rodents, moving from tropical zones into temperate zones. They're more worried about them moving from nature into places where humans live, work, and generally exist. Now, to be clear, there are many non-climate change reasons that rodents are increasingly moving from nature into places where humans are. Across the world, we are cutting down more forests, expanding more farms and cities, and pushing more roads and mines deeper into wild habitats. But many studies show that in addition to those factors, climate change is also pushing rodents into closer contact with humans. Back in 2023, Dr. Douglas helped conduct a systematic review of the scientific literature around hantavirus and climate change. What he found was that in areas where climate change was making things wetter, rodent populations were exploding.
So when you have a lot of rainfall, what happens? The soil moisture increases, plant and vegetation growth increases, and then you get the production of food and food availability for the rodent. And so you get a population boom within the rodent population. And when you do that, then you increase the risk of humans coming into contact either directly with rodents or indirectly with contaminated dust through the infected rodents' excreta.
In addition, according to Dr. Douglas's research, rodents and humans also risk coming into contact more in places where climate change is making things drier.
So you have drought. Now that also impacts negatively on food availability and also on rodents. So you have less food available. So what do rodents do? They will go seeking food from somewhere. And what do humans do during drought? We store food, in particular within the Latin America region. Stored grains are where you have the most attraction for rodents so that they can have food when food is not available. But this also brings them into closer contact with humans.
This pattern has also shown up in human disease data. A 2024 study in JAMA Network Open found that after severe flooding in China's Yangtze River Basin, the risk of rodent-borne hantavirus disease remained elevated for up to 3 years. Of course, the data can be complicated. It's not linear and the same everywhere. One study in Arizona, for instance, found that extreme flooding didn't help the area's dominant kangaroo rat population. It actually nearly wiped them out completely. But that study also showed that the area's pocket mice population survived and surged. And so it permanently changed which rodents dominated the landscape. What I'm saying is the picture of climate change's impact on weather and rodent populations can be complicated, but overall it appears to be pushing human and rodent populations closer together. And weather changes are not the only way that climate change can worsen the spread of infectious diseases like hantavirus. Climate change is also worsening other problems that are contributing to disease spread, like increased urbanization, or put another way, the exodus of people out of rural areas and into cities. Here's Dr. Shepard.
One of the great effects on us as hosts of infections is that we're moving, we're migrating. But we're moving because we can no longer sustain lifestyles that used to sustain us for millennia, like subsistence farming, for instance, in Africa. There are parts that are getting too dry or too wet or too unpredictable. And so people are moving, but they're moving from the countryside into the cities. And so we're urbanizing, a vast movement driven by climate, driven by unpredictability, driven by the difficulties of growing food in a very unpredictable climate, primarily in the hotter, poorer parts of the world. The biggest cities in the world in 50 years are nearly all going to be in Africa, and they're going to be projected close to 100 million people in some of these cities.
Another big problem that climate change is worsening is the loss of biodiversity. The IPCC has found that with every little bit of warming, extinction risk rises. At 1.5 degrees Celsius, the median share of species at very high risk of extinction is estimated at 9%. At 2 degrees Celsius, it's 10%. At 3 degrees Celsius, it's 12%, and so on and so on and so on. This is not good for diseases.
As biodiversity goes down, as environments are denuded, often things that carry infections and transmit infections, hosts and vectors, tend to be more robust. They move in.
Now again, just to put a pinpoint on it, scientists are clear that it's difficult to pinpoint the precise influence of climate change on this specific strain of hantavirus. Here's Dr. Angel Desai, an infectious disease physician at the University of California, Davis, talking about that uncertainty.
It's tough because while there are all of these things going on with climate, there's also all these other things going on in the context of human behavior. So it's always a challenge to be able to parse out what exactly is specifically related to climate-related factors and what's related to the other factors. But in my mind, I think that it's all connected. And I think that there is good evidence to suggest that weather, climate are driving infectious diseases in sort of new and interesting ways.
Still, each scientist I spoke to was adamant that even if we can't pinpoint the exact influence of climate change on the Andes virus outbreak, it's still worth talking about. One reason is because in the very near future, forecasters predict we're about to experience one of the strongest El Nino events in recorded history, an event that is made stronger by climate change. And that may impact rodent populations around the world, but also specifically in Argentina and Chile, where the Andes virus originates.
When you're having what we're going to have later this year, a very strong El Nino year, the rodent populations in the wet, humid, agricultural areas of the world tend to explode and overpopulate, have massive increases. And that will increase the number of pathogens that they carry and introduce into the environment at the same time, most of which aren't nearly as deadly as hantavirus. But for sure, there will be changes in vectors and viruses and bacteria in the environment as a result of this super strong El Nino.
Another reason it's wise to talk about climate change in relation to this hantavirus outbreak is that it highlights the need for governments to invest in research models that take climate change into consideration when forecasting disease outbreaks. Here's Dr. Kirk Douglas.
Why can't you forecast the risk of infectious diseases that can assist you in planning and preparing just like you would for a hurricane? You don't want to wait until the hurricane is at your door to ensure you have food supplies, ensure that you have taken all the necessary preparative steps to minimize the impact. So it's not that you're going to prevent it. The aim is to mitigate and to reduce the risk.
Overall, the scientists I spoke with said this hantavirus outbreak highlights the fact that the conditions for infectious disease outbreaks are changing, and they're changing faster than our systems for predicting and preventing those outbreaks. And in a climate-changed world, we can no longer think of diseases like hantavirus as something to get rid of.
As far as infectious diseases are concerned, they are here forever. They're part of our environment. They're part of the natural order of things. They're part of ecological systems. They are in balance and then sometimes out of balance just naturally. And the thought that we can expunge them as we used to fool ourselves, I think, is a fantasy. We need to have some respect for our situation. We need to recognize that we're not top dog. We're just another member of an exceptionally complex, interdependent ecosystem. And, if we feel that we're the smartest, and okay, fine, but you have to have the respect to not destroy the habitat for the other inhabitants of that ecosystem, because that's what protects us. So we have to have a philosophical change in the way that we view our place on the planet.
Yeah, it sounds like, one of the lessons here, a big lesson here that I'm taking from this is that humans don't get to dominate nature without consequences, because those consequences will eventually show up in our bodies.
Yes, and I think we may dominate in a way, but we will not dominate permanently. I think there's no sort of scientific rationale from assuming that we would survive by destroying the environment around us. And ultimately, by disrupting the environment so completely, we are likely to fuel more and more pandemics. We have to recognize that we are part of a complex, biodiverse, planetary system, and that we screw with it at our peril.
And that's all I have for you today. To learn more and to get access to some of our full interviews with experts, become a subscriber to the Heated newsletter. You can do that by searching Heated on Substack, Heated newsletter on Google, or typing in heated.world into your URL bar. Heated is a 100% reader-funded operation. We don't run ads or sponsored content. We don't take any money from corporations, billionaires, or nonprofits. And we do this so you know that you can trust our reporting, which, by the way, is original. I conducted all these interviews myself, with the help of our producer, Tracy Wolf. So, if you'd like to support our mission and help keep our content free for everyone, you can do that at the Heated newsletter. Liking and subscribing here is also very helpful. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.